You're tuned into The Collective Voice, thought-provoking interviews co-hosted by young adults, fostering deep faith through courageous questions. Welcome to the conversation. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Collective Voice. I'm Reverend Phil Dieke, the Director of Congregational Innovation at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And today we are having another conversation about Hungry for Hope, Letters to the Church from Young Adults. And if you can't see, I'm holding the book. I finally have a copy of the book. I had done 2 interviews previously and did not have the book, and now I actually have it. I'm so excited. Shout out to Christina for sending me a copy of the book, because it's a gift. This whole book is such a gift, not only to the church for sure, but for all of us who care about the church and have been practitioners of faith. And I'm really excited about this episode. I've loved the other ones too, for sure, but climate justice, climate catastrophe, environmental justice, the caretakers of God's creation. There's so many versions of what people have called this over time. But the topic of this chapter specifically has been really intriguing to me and personally. And so I'm really excited to be joined by JD Mechelke, who co-authored a chapter. Let me get the specific title of the chapter here, because I don't want to screw it up, JD. I'm already going to mess up titles here. So the title of this chapter specifically was Destruction and Recreation, Wayfinding in a Climate Apocalypse. What a title for a chapter, right? We'll get to the chapter here in a second, but first of all, I'd love for you to just introduce yourself to our listeners and give us a little sense on your own bio here.
Yeah. So I'm, first of all, I live in a vehicle, an old bus I turned into a house. Right now I'm in the interface of the Sonoran and Mojave deserts, where they kind of collide together in central western Arizona. I'm a PhD candidate at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. And in my work, I think about and explore what it means, or rather, what might a life look like? What might living a good life look like as an earthling in a precarious, fragile world? And I kind of do that, on the one hand, through my lived experience on the road, and on the other hand, through particular kind of academic disciplines like continental philosophy, radical and political theology, queer studies, and post-human theory, and that's kind of the where I am now version. Yeah.
Are you a Pete Rollins fan?
Oh yeah, no, I've read Pete. Yeah. No,
Caputo?
yeah. Oh yeah, Caputo, of course. Yep. I think I mentioned him briefly in this chapter. I think, if I remember right, it's been a year or two since me and Talitha
Sure.
wrote the chapter, but I'm pretty sure we did mention Caputo. But yeah.
Yeah, I remember finding radical theology right as I was going through the ordination process, and I was like, this may be a really bad thing for me, because I feel like the ordination committee is not going to know what to do with me wrestling with radical theology in the midst of all of this. But I do think it's an important voice. Yeah, it's a really great voice to have in conversation, especially when talking about things like climate catastrophe and such. So
Totally.
Would love to know what it was like writing this book or this chapter with Reverend Talitha, and I might end up screwing up her name too. Amadea Aho, is that right? Is that close?
Amadea is always
Amadea. Okay,
but I could be wrong now that I think about it. I'm
you
doubting
know,
myself, but
yeah, she's a Presbyterian pastor though, right? Is that correct?
yeah. She's a chaplain in
Yeah, that's right.
in Berkeley. Yeah.
Yeah. What was that like writing with her?
Oh, it was wonderful. I mean, Talitha is just a wealth of experience and grace and precision, and she brings brought a great perspective to this chapter, because she's in full-time ministry, and she wrote this great, wonderful book on more young adults, as in like teenagers, doing youth ministry during a climate catastrophe, during the climate apocalypse, and kind of fronting their voices. And that's just a wonderful book. Of course, I should have found the title. I should have the title. I have the book in the bus. I should have brought it with me.
It's okay. I can. I'll link it in the show notes. That's fine. We'll figure it out.
Great, thank you. But no, it was really wonderful to have her writing this chapter with me. I was just, it was just so much better because of that.
So why this chapter, right? Like what about this really? Well, I'd love to know first of all how you got connected with the Riverside Innovation Hub, right? And like got to be a part of this writing project. But then why did you choose to write about this chapter? The specific idea?
Yeah, yeah. So for me, the question of, in this chapter, wayfinding in a climate apocalypse, I grew up hearing, there was the common refrains like everything will be okay, no matter what, not just climate, but, just kind of general axioms of God has a reason for this, God will make this good. Um, and that was just a very strong part of kind of the um, in implicit theology growing up. Throughout my family, throughout my neighborhood, there was this just kind of sense that God had a plan and you're just along for the ride. But then, of course, during COVID, the first COVID years, I think it was 2020 actually. I was living in Brooklyn, and of course, so there was that apocalypse happening, this plague happening, and in Brooklyn, no less. And I was reading David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth, right? And kind of the first sentence of the book is something like, "It is much, much worse than you think." And I was kind of diving through some data sets about different scenarios for just sea level rise. And I realized that even if on that day I was reading that book, sitting in my apartment in Brooklyn, even if on that day, we went completely net zero on greenhouse gas emissions on that day, even in that scenario, by the end of the century, where I was reading that book would be underwater. And so for me, it was this wake-up call of how catastrophic things, how much we'd already screwed up the earth, how many greenhouse gas emissions we'd already put into the atmosphere. It was just nuts to me, and it really jolted me out of certain status quo ways of looking at my life and looking at climate change as just any quote unquote any other issue in the political sphere. And so for me, that's really where that journey started for me. And of course, on a personal level, I grew up in a rural neighborhood. I grew up camping I was a 6-month-old infant the first time we went camping, in a tent on the river, right? So, in that sense, the natural world was always the non-human world was always really present in my life because camping was just such a big factor growing up. And of course now, it's I live out here. It's more often, so my partner's with me in the bus, but between the two of us, we don't really see anybody else most of the time. And of course, we go to events and stuff. Like we'll go to Vansgiving in a few weeks to see all our friends.
You said
My
Vansgiving, as in
Yeah,
like
yeah, Vansgiving. All the people who live with their vehicles, we all
that's
get together for
amazing.
Thanksgiving. And of course, when we go down to Baja, and then we're just surrounded by people, and it's just a nonstop, you know, friend fest. A lot of the time in the fall and the summer, we're just kind of off by ourselves. And so there's kind of the catastrophism of it. And then there's this on the road, I kind of run into these hypercontextual examples of climate catastrophe. When I'm driving, in northern Arizona, driving through Tuba City, and I see remnants of an old uranium mine that's contaminated groundwater, right? Or this kind of the crazy drought and the forest fires, of course, out west. I situate myself often between the Sierras and the Rockies, right? That's where most of the nation's public land and is where I get to camp for free. But in that space, right, I run into like the slow death of saguaro, because the area around Phoenix in the low desert has just gotten so crazy hot. Um, the bleaching of reefs when I go swimming in the Sea of Cortez, or the spruce beetles taking root in the San Juan Mountains, and just destroying entire forests of spruce. And so there's this big catastrophe that I kind of came to witness. And now on the road, I kind of run into these hyper-contextual kind of red flags saying something's going on here. But that
Yeah,
is how I would say I got into this. That's kind of the two frameworks, or not the frameworks, but the two modes I enter into this kind of conversation.
yeah, just paying attention, right? Like just by being aware.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which y'all call it in the book, in the chapter, you say it's facing the end of climate stability, right? And I think
Yeah.
it's probably a little bit of what Talitha talks about in her other book, but this idea that for so long we've been just kind of operating out of the status quo and just hoping and assuming, or, you even use the Deus ex machina, right? Like the idea of like the
Yeah.
omnipotent God's going to just come in and swoop in and save everything at some point.
Yeah.
Um, I'd love to just hear a little bit about like what facing the end of climate stability means to you, and then
Yeah.
like we'll slowly then get into like what does that also mean for the church and people of faith in general. But what does that mean to you personally?
Totally. There's kind of two academic words that I find useful, the Holocene and the Anthropocene. And so there's these two, they're geological epochs, right? If you take time and think of it on a geological scale, right, then it's just time becomes this vast horizon of billions of years. But then you can chop it up into different epochs. And the geological epoch that human civilization has known, the Holocene, right, has been a fairly stable climate era that we've been blessed with to become who we are today, right, as a species. But we've entered this, it seems like, the official International Council on Stratigraphy is being a bit too hesitant, but most of us, in the academy are using this term Anthropocene to say, no, we've left the Holocene. There is something radically different about where we are now. We can't be thinking of ourselves anymore as humans in the Holocene that have this wide expanse in the horizon of this kind of stable climate, Holocene-like conditions, because that's, throughout human history, we've gone through endless war, we've gone through plagues, we've gone through horrible natural disasters, but it always seemed like there was time to figure it all out. There was this expanse of time in the future that made us hope that, okay, well, no matter the trouble we get ourselves into, we'll figure it out. But the Anthropocene, when we think of ourselves as we're no longer humans in the Holocene, but we're what the philosopher Bruno Latour has said, we're the earthbound in the Anthropocene. And when we think of ourselves as entering this new climate epoch, it seems like the time to figure all that stuff out is running short. And so that's a radical difference that I like to remind myself of. And so what does that tell me about, I think God is kind of the question, the theological question was where you were headed. Am I right there? I've
Yeah.
already wandered off from the original question,
Well,
forgive me, but
we can stay here in this though because excuse me, I think that move right from these two different epochs is really important, and it makes me think also of one of my seminary professors was Jorg Rieger, and he talked about he has a
yeah,
book on theology and the Capitalocene, right? Like
yeah,
the
yeah,
idea that um, it's not just humanity, right? Really, it's this idea of capitalism that has really been what's driving so much of putting
totally.
us in the place we are. And it makes me think back to, again, one of the things y'all say in the book, in the chapters, our individual acts of repentance were never enough to wash away the systemic sins of extractive capitalism, right?
Yeah,
So
totally.
maybe touch on that before we get to the God piece of it, or maybe they're intertwined here. But
Sure. I mean, they're always intertwined. I mean, you can't have a political claim. A political claim is always a theological claim. Same with economics.
whew, amen to that.
Yeah, but um, no, that's a great book by Rieger, and so that one's in the bus too. And so so there's our debates about where we should say the Anthropocene started, but and that's an interesting and important question because where you claim this new epoch started changes how you'll think of the solutions and the actions we need to take to maybe stabilize the planet. in the best case of scenarios. And so if you start the Anthropocene with the invention of internal combustion, right? You're going to imagine solutions directly related to just simply greenhouse gas emissions, right? And that's kind of the framework a lot of political systems have been using. Lots of liberal democracies have been thinking in those terms, which isn't a bad term. But Rieger and this philosopher, I forget his first name, but Moore, argue that, well, no, the Anthropocene, and others have argued this too, but the Anthropocene really should begin with the emergence of industrial capitalism. And there's lots of great arguments for that I won't get into, but I'll say that, well, when you change the sort of the Anthropocene to the sort of capitalism, well, then the solutions we imagine, right, the political will and utopian kind of vision we begin to have isn't just about greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also about, well, what if we don't structure our economy on a vision of success that's tied to growth of the GDP, right? Well, what if we structure our economy around human flourishing, right, and the flourishing of all everything that's bound to the earth, right? And so that's where we begin the story changes the solutions we'll start to imagine. Because when we tell stories, of course, stories are really helpful, but we do have to be careful because they start to box in our imagination. And so that's the interesting thing about capitalism, is when we don't have that in the picture, well, it's outside of our imagination, right? For what the future can hold.
Yeah, I think you get into that a little bit with this idea of the myth of progress, right?
Yeah,
You want to expound
totally.
on that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So progress is the kind of the boogie monster in some ways in the chapter, right?
The boogie monster.
So the interesting, so like the really interesting thing about Christian theology is that it's kind of the first one of the first major and dominant voices in human history that says that time is linear, that it's a line, that it's not a circle, for example, or it's not kind of a spiral, but it's that time is a line, and there's a past and there's a future, and we're headed somewhere. And for, of course, for a lot of Christian theology, that's kind of the sense of the future is God's providence in this new heaven and new earth, right? That we think of in theology as eschatology, right? As of course you know, progress seeped into this myth of kind of this linear time. That as time moves forward, right, science will advance. Humans will just inevitably start flourishing. Even our own lives, right, have this kind of myth of progress built in that you will be happier as you start to fit into, the American dream is a progress myth. So you'll begin to be happier as you buy a house, get kids, take on this big mortgage. But then retirement, you have this retirement to look forward to. And you have this economic stability to wean all that in. But progress also seeps, obviously, like I alluded to our theology about the future. And Martin Luther King Jr. had a version of this too, right? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? But the problem again with the Anthropocene, right? When we think things are radically different now, we're no longer humans in the Holocene. Progress in the Anthropocene turns into this kind of hubris hope that numbs us into thinking it'll all work out, right? And me and Talitha argue that the church needs to get out of this progress narrative and find where it still has as it has different holding places in our theologies and in our practices, because what it's doing is it's just lulling us into thinking everything is going to be okay. It's lulling us into thinking we're still humans in the Holocene, because when we see the story, right? Back to the stories and how they change the way we think of possibilities and imagination, right? Progress limits our imagination to certain solutions. But when we get rid of progress, um, we start to imagine things, imagine possibilities radically outside of the status quo, like, let's say, the end of capitalism, right? Or we start to imagine, well, what does it mean? Yeah, to live on a finite planet. Well, then maybe measuring economic success as growth and extraction maybe isn't a good idea, right? And so this myth of progress is boxed in our imaginations. And if we get rid of that myth, well, we can start to imagine some pretty cool things. But it's scary, though. It's scary, though, to, I know when I let go of this story of progress, it's not at first an easy thing to reckon with, right? Especially on a personal level, right? Um, we don't have, we think of kind of the economic instability in the United States, we'll just say, right? I don't have this sense that, well, it'll be easy for me to buy a house and easy for me to pay it off and just relatively easy for me to coast into a retirement, or in my, academic life to get a tenure track job with all this, just taking away funding from higher ed that the current administration is doing, right? And so when I let go of that myth of progress, it is scary. When I let go of the myth of progress, I realize, I can't trust that these big governments and big tech solutions are going to solve the catastrophe of climate change. So it's scary. And in some sense, it's hopeless, right? And of course, I'm sure I'm alluding to something we'll talk about. But
we'll get into hopelessness, yes.
yeah. But maybe I'll hold it there then. Yeah.
Well, I just really appreciate. I've been doing a lot of. Have you read or listened to Michael Mead at all? He does a lot about mythology and myth and.
No, I'll have to look him up. I think I recognize the name, but
yeah,
but it doesn't.
He talks a lot about how, there's the literal, there's the metaphorical, and then there's the mythological. Every situation you can approach through those three different kind of lenses.
Yeah.
And I think that we're in a space where we need to start embracing the mythological understanding of our reality. And so when you started talking about the myth of progress, I was just totally keen into it. But I also wanted to reference it back to, you talked about like Black Elk and the Lakota people, and that in some ways there are people who have been telling other stories all along.
Totally.
Just that we have been so succumbed to this myth of progress up and to the right. It's always going to continue on in that direction. So I would love if you would share a bit about, I don't know if it was you who was writing about Black Elk specifically. I think it was.
Yeah.
I have that book actually, which I love, until my dog got a hold of it. Apparently he loved it as well and wanted to consume that book too. But,
well, that's great.
Yeah, so if you would just share a little bit about Black Elk and what the aspect of storytelling, maybe from some Indigenous folks, it maybe hope for us in the midst of this. I know we're going to use the word hope carefully here, right? Because we'll circle back to that. And the other piece, I'm like throwing so many things at you here, but the other thing you said, like the idea of time is linear as a kind of a Western construct, I think is, and you reference this idea of, Chronos versus Kairos at some point. I think you referenced another book in the chapter too, but you talk a lot about time is out of joint right now. And so that's a lot, right? There's myth and like who's telling better stories. There's the idea of time and what role that plays. Blackout, like there's a lot to jump into there, but just whatever spurs in the midst of that for you.
No, totally. And Blackout, that was part of that was kind of one of the sections I wrote. With Black Elk, he was a Lakota warrior and who had this very mythical experience. And for him, he lived through the massacre at Wounded Knee. And for him, that was a moment that was an apocalyptic moment, and life after that was post-apocalyptic, right? The world had ended for him. And for lots of Indigenous people on this continent, right, and throughout the world, right, worlds ended when, through the process of colonialism and imperialism, and of course with Black folk that were brought from the African continent to this one as slaves, of course, all over the world. that was also a world ending, right? That was also a post-apocalyptic existence. And so people have been living through in a post-apocalyptic world for a while. And so that's one thing we draw in on the chapter is, well, what can we glean from these stories about how to live in a post-apocalyptic world in the Anthropocene, right? Who have already been living in post-apocalyptic times, and another indigenous thinker that we bring up in the chapters, Plenty-Coup, who talks about hope, that when the object of that there is a point where an object of hope, like returning to a pre-apocalyptic moment, right? When that hope becomes just cruel. But I'll leave that for a moment. To go on to your point about kind of Chronos and Kairos. There was something else, of course, I wanted to say about Chronos and Kairos that I've lost. Give
Well,
me
I know in
just
the
a
book
second.
you reference someone's commentary on Romans, I think, and with Paul, like not only
Sure.
is it time, it's the form is changing, right? That
Yeah. Oh, it was Apocalypse. Sorry. That was thank you for jolting my memory. With Apocalypse, so my advisor, Catherine Keller at Drew, she's written 2 books now about Apocalypse.
that's a gift in and of itself, right? Having your advisor be Catherine Keller, that's pretty awesome.
Totally. No, it's been great. She's a really wonderful mentor and teacher with me. I'm so grateful to have her.
Yeah,
Um, and so grateful. And she reminds us, right, that apocalypse is in, at least with the Greek, in with the New Testament writers, the apocalypse isn't an end, but it's an unveiling, right? It's the apocalypse. This is literally at the moment the bride comes to the altar and removes the veil. That's the apocalypse. So for Dr. Keller, the apocalypse is a moment. It's not a closure, but a disclosure, right? It's a
yeah, that's
moment
good.
to open our eyes. And so that's one thing that kind of Plenty-Coup alludes to. Uh, for Black Elk, less so, I think. But the Christian tradition, the biblical tradition at least, does give us that sense of the apocalypse, right? That when everything is lost, right? When all of your hopes are shattered, right? When Jesus dies on the cross, right? That isn't the end of the story, is it? Which I still struggle with. I still struggle with that. How can that not be the end of the story? But it's not, right? It's a moment, it's an unveiling, right? Of course, in that context about empire and such. But yeah, the Kairos, right, is that. So whereas Chronos is more kind of that kind of flat time that we experience day to day. Kairos is this where it all kind of seems, where everything gets really dense all of a sudden. It's that event in your life where Derrida would talk about it, the French philosopher. He would talk about Kairos is kind of the radically unforeseeable future, right? So the future present is that kind of future we can have a fairly good guess about, right? The sun, right, is gonna set over there in the west as it has the last couple of nights, right? That's the future present, right? Or my I'm gonna need another cup of coffee, in about 2 hours, as I do most days. That's the future present. But what is the radically unforeseeable present, that kairos, that moment where an event happens, when with a knife that slashes into that? What is the hope that is not, or sorry, what is the future that just not a good bet, um, but would totally change everything? That's kind of the kairos, yeah.
Okay, we've been dancing around hope. Let's dive in on
Yeah.
hope here. Like,
Hope.
I think it's so just confession here, right? So
Yeah.
my work at the seminary, I do this young adult initiative we call 787 Collective, and then my other
Yeah.
role is with working with small town and rural churches that we
Yeah.
call houses of hope, right?
Oh,
Which,
yeah. Yeah.
um, in some ways I've loved because we've seen hope either be like we often talk about it as even within places that have like very grim expectations or lacking hope, that there's always embers, right? That there's embers of hope that continue to not burn. They're not quite burning yet, right? But we get the opportunity to come in
Yeah.
and fan those embers, right? To hopefully bring some hope back into those spaces.
Yeah.
I was listening to Miguel de la Torre, right, the professor at ILIF.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gave a talk. They invited him as an ethicist to come speak about AI, right? And he was like, I don't know anything about AI. I don't know anything about this. I don't want to do this. And they're like, no, but we really think we need your like liberative
Yeah.
ethic to be a part of this conversation. And
Yeah.
he talked about hope as a middle class privilege, right? And he's
Yeah.
got a book called Embracing Hopelessness, which
Yeah.
preparing for this, I was like, okay, I got to order that book. I kept putting it off, and I was like, no, I got to get that book. I got to read that book.
Yeah.
So you just talked about how sometimes hope can end up being becoming cruel, right? So share with us a bit about hope in the midst of where we find ourselves in this current epoch, and like where we're emerging, and if hopelessness, if hope can be cruel,
Yeah.
what does that leave us with?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll start with the cruel. My use of the word cruel comes from this theorist named Lauren Berlant, who had this great book at the beginning of this century called Cruel Optimism. And in that book, she's kind of analyzing how a particular form of capitalism we call neoliberalism, which is just kind of like a supply side economics, right, on the economic front, where you kind of, lower taxes on the rich is kind of the simple way to put it, right? To spur economic growth. The trickle down, right? That's supply side economics in a very crude nutshell. But in a kind of more cultural sense, right? It is that myth, of the
Bootstraps.
bootstraps. Thank you.
Pick it
Yeah,
by your
thank
own
you.
bootstraps.
That's exactly the word I was looking for. Yeah, the bootstraps, right?
Your rigor's still in my head, right? Like
Totally.
This was so much of what my intro to theology was all about.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
like, oh, the gospel is economic, and I never was invited to read it through that lens. So yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
totally. No, you were blessed to have him as a teacher. He's so great. He's so great. You, but yeah, so there is this kind of, but also neoliberalism tells us that, well, what it means to be human is to be economically free, right? To be able to participate in a free market. That's when you are truly free. But Lauren Berlant, right, talks about how the American dream, particularly since kind of that era of the neoliberal era of Clinton, more or less, is really where in Reagan, where it really took a foothold. Is when the housing. Now, of course, we're kind of seeing this in the United States, where the housing market is really horrible, because the American dream is a form of political optimism for Berlant that's just interwoven with home ownership. And there is this cruel optimism that, well, if you participate in this economy, right, you'll be fine, right? And of course, it's cruel because it's not turned out to be true. But that's the cruel part. And so hope, when the object of a hope, let's say, leads to your kind of almost demise, right? If you chase after that dream almost too hard, you're gonna run into kind of despair. But let me go to with the hope, so the title of the book, Hungry for Hope, right? There was this discussion beginning on that we should call it Haunted by Hope. And which I'm still sad, but that was a publisher. The publisher wasn't sure that title would sell.
That's fair.
But so because I know with all the authors, right, especially the young adult authors, we weren't hungry for hope. I don't know, we were more haunted by it. And a haunting, of course, is when something is absent, right? It's that it's when something that is, exterior is kind of impacting the interior. It's when the haunting is kind of that event when the Kairos time breaks in, right? That's a haunting of a ghost in some ways. But so
I think
yeah,
that's
go
just
ahead. Tell me. Yeah.
Talking about a message for the church, right? Because
Yeah.
so often, what is it? It's Barbara Brown Taylor calls them like full light churches, or I forget exactly what term she uses, but they only talk about joy, only talk about the positive side of things, aren't willing to embrace the negative or like even the lament side of things, right? Like the CCLI, the worship music, like less than 7%, I think, of songs on the CCLI have to do with anything lament or even like sad, right? It's all just like happy joy, right? So there's some sense in the church of we don't even want to touch that, right?
Yeah. No, there really is. That's one. Yeah, I mean, for me, that's one of the reasons I always got disillusioned by a lot of churches, is because they gave me too much hope. Because of course, so the philosopher Ernst Bloch, that so for those who in the room that went to seminary, of course, right, like you, you
Totally.
probably know Jürgen Moltmann is a really big figure, right, in theology in the 20th century, and he wrote on Ernst Bloch to make his theology of hope. But what Bloch says is that hope is only possible when it's hopeless. Right? There is, if things aren't hopeless, then hope is a good bet, right? That's not hope. When things aren't hopeless, I think Caputo probably said this. But he says something to the effect, that when you're, that's that the realm of it's a good the realm of good bet, right? Is the realm of the 401ks, and lawn services, right? That's a good bet. That's not hopeless, right? And so in order to have hope in something, it has to be hopeless. That is a condition for hope. And that's the fun, interesting thing, of course, about Christian theology is there is this really strong piece of hopelessness in it. And yeah, the full light churches, I hadn't heard that. I have to go back to Barbara
Learning to
Brown
Walk in the
Taylor.
Dark. Barbara Brown Taylor, Learning to Walk in the Dark.
Oh yeah, gosh,
Fabulous
yeah.
book. Yeah.
Oh yeah, now I have to read that.
Especially as we turn to the winter season, I feel like it's a really good seasonal book to read for sure.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, that's good. But yeah, but sometimes a hubris hope is what we called it, or maybe a cruel optimism. It becomes a stumbling block for our imaginations. So with progress, we kind of with this moral arc of the universe that bends towards justice, we have this kind of hubris hope that isn't maybe a hopeless hope, right? Whereas a hubris hope tells us that it kind of gets us complacent again. It numbs us. It makes us believe that we're still humans in the Holocene. And so that's why I kind of want the church to preach a gospel of eco-catastrophism, right? I want them to give us the church to be a place of preaching catastrophe almost. Ironically, this is something Catherine Keller talks about. She plays on the ironic part of, for a long time, it was conservative evangelicals or different other conservative sects of Christianity that was always preaching the end is near, right? That the rapture is coming, and of course now she's so a lot of us, on the other side of things, the other side of the political theological spectrum, right? Are saying, well, no, the end is near. Right? We need
full
to preach
circle.
the
Here we go.
Yeah, full circle.
Yeah.
But the our theologies of progress allow to hold on to a hubris hope, right? That unshakable feeling that everything will be okay. But I'm not trying to say we should get rid of hope, right? Of course, we're not saying that. But when the object of our hope becomes inevitable, right? That's a good bet, right? That's lawn services and 401ks, right? But that's when hope degrades into hubris, right? And so, Gregory of Nicaea talks about basking in the brilliant darkness, right, where Moses found God. It's about letting the hopelessness in. I'm a Lutheran, so for me, it's like it's to be a theologian of the cross, right? To tell a thing what it actually is. Caputo talks about hope as kind of the risky. He says hope is the risky business of calling for the coming of what we cannot see coming. Right? Hope is about hoping in that unforeseeable future, in that kairos. But I've gotten on my sermon soapbox.
It's the Holy Saturday, right? Like it's the
Yeah, no, it
sitting in the
is.
Holy
Yeah,
Saturday that feels, again, most of the churches just totally gloss over that in terms of Holy Week, right? We go from Monday,
yeah,
Thursday to Good Friday, and then Saturdays, Easter celebrations or whatever, and then all
yeah,
of a sudden it's Easter morning, and there's
yeah,
not that sitting with the darkness, the silence, the solitude of Easter Saturday
yeah,
that allows us to just revel in that hopelessness.
yeah,
Because we already know the end of the story. Like we already have a bet, right? Like we've bet on the end of this story because we've heard it
yeah,
before, you know?
yeah, yeah,
And what happens when we all of a sudden don't know how the story's going to end, which I think is where more and more of us are finding ourselves now with this climate catastrophe.
yeah, yeah. And that's that's a debate sometimes I have with Catherine, Dr. Keller, is on eschatology. Because a long time ago, she wrote a review of one of Boltman's later books. This was years ago when she was kind of a younger scholar, and she was praising him in a lot of ways. But she said, "I still worry, though, that Moltmann, that you have this kind of this firm end that things will definitely end in a new heaven and new earth." And I think because the book was on climate catastrophe of some sort, I forget now the details. But but now as she's gotten older, she's softened a little bit. She makes a distinction between optimism and hope. But sometimes I worry that, like, maybe we just need to completely revise our eschatology, which is pretty radical. I mean, that's not going to fly. I should be confessing this on. That's okay. That's okay.
You can look. You can throw it out there. You can always take it back. Like this is what we do, right? We work through these things. And Paul talks
Yeah,
about wrestling with this faith, right? We're working it out as we go. So wrestling with our salvation. So,
totally.
I mean, I'm curious though, right? Because I think my closing kind of like wrap up on this really is, our audience is kind of twofold, right? Our audience is
Yeah,
young adults as we try to center the voice of young people in faith formation, and so a lot of this podcast is about creating solidarity with other young adults in the midst of
yeah,
their ongoing faith formation in this destruction, right, that we're experiencing.
yeah,
And then the secondary audience is those who want to be in ministry with and for, right, like for young adults. And so in some ways, if you're talking about a revised eschatology, like that's a message
yeah,
for the church, right? Like
yeah, totally. Yeah.
what is that message to the church then,
I don't have a good answer right now, of course, but
That's fair. That's fair.
no, but I just go back to, like, I want us to preach a gospel of, right, eco-catastrophism, right, this theology of the cross, which tells a thing what it is, and that's that things are, not looking good right now, of course. I mean, it was just a couple days ago in Vietnam, right? They had, what was it, 5.6 feet of water come down in 24 hours, right? Which was like the second largest, rainfall recorded in all of human history, right? It's like things are getting nuts. And in the same day, of course, then you had that latest hurricane pummeling Jamaica.
Yeah,
Um,
185-mile-an-hour winds, I think is what it was, or something like
oh
that.
yeah,
Like it's
just nuts. Yeah, 185-mile-per-hour winds. I mean, I remember that hurricane I mentioned in the book, Hurricane Ian, that impacted my family. Uh, that was a crazy. I remember that was, an insane wind speed, but but it was
yeah,
like 30 degrees less than the
yeah,
one that just happened in
155, I think,
Jamaica.
right? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's just nuts. And so but the Lancet just put out this is ended on hopelessness, I guess, but the Lancet just put out the kind of the premier medical journal, just said that in the world today, every minute somebody is dying because of just heat, um, which is just crazy. But uh, not in the direction of conclusions. I'm sorry, I got distracted there.
No, look, I said direction, right? We don't have to. It's not linear, right? Let's go back to
Yeah,
this.
there. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's good. Um, but that's I don't have a good answer on eschatology. I'm not a good theologian. Sometimes I'm in that sense, right? I I like teaching theology, but I tend to write more on philosophy. So I hope there is a really good theologian out there that'll work through an eschatology. So I'm punting to those listening, right, to the young adults thinking about this now.
I love that.
You
Yeah, it's
know,
a good invitation.
um, is, what will this look like, right? How do we have, a hope, a true hope in a new heaven and a new earth, right? And if it's a true hope, it can't be a hubris hope, right? It can't be a middle class privilege, right? Um, what I mean, and so sometimes I worry that I don't know if we could preach a new heaven and new earth anymore, but maybe somebody will prove me wrong. So
We welcome that, right? If you're listening to
yeah,
this and you want to write a new
yeah,
eschatology on
yeah,
that, reach out.
totally.
We would love. We'll bring JD back too. It'll be a panel discussion and it'll be good.
Yeah, but um, yeah.
Well, let me ask you this: as you again, you do a lot of philosophizing as well as theologizing, and you just read a lot. So, in terms of good stories, what are the
Mm,
stories that you're finding that not necessarily bring about hope, but are awakening you to the beauty that still exists in the midst of this world?
sure. I really love just to think of concrete books, right? There's this great book by the feminist Donna Haraway. Um, I forget the exact. Staying with the Trouble is the title. Making Kin in the Thulacene, which is another play on Anthropocene. She's got some great storytelling woven throughout that book, and of course, another great book I've really come to love. Anna Singh, she's an anthropologist, feminist. She has this great book called "The Mushroom at the End of the World," on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. And those two books really, for me, kind of help us think about a world without progress that isn't just, death and destruction, Mad Max, right? Um, and lately, too, I've been leaning on two philosophers that I wouldn't recommend to read necessarily, but I'll give a point to mention, right? But Deleuze and Guattari, they're these two French philosophers, and one of the things they wrote about in a book called A Thousand Plateaus, kind of leaning on Nietzsche, previous philosophers, they were saying sometimes we're just too human. Maybe we need to become animal and become rock and become canyon, right? I'm in this area where there's just Joshua trees everywhere. I've never seen, and the fun thing about this place I'm at is kind of maybe start bring us back full circle to the beginning, right? Where I'm at this interface of the Sonoran and the Mojave deserts, where it's odd because the Joshua trees are mingling with the saguaros, which is not something I see in the desert except right here, you know. And so in this time where we're kind of in this interface, right? And we're seeing odd things next to each other. When we're seeing Joshua trees next to saguaro, I wonder, what does it mean to become rock again, right? To become animal, to become tree. What is it? We're a little too human sometimes. That's something maybe Bart would resonate with, right? For him is we just need to be creatures. We're not God, and that's what got us into this mess, maybe.
One of the quotes that haunts me continuously is E.O. Wilson. I don't know if you've ever read much of E.O. Wilson. He was a
No.
biologist, did a lot of work on ants, but he's brilliant and just such a beautiful writer. But he says that the problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
sits with me a
Totally.
lot. So I love this idea of maybe like let's scale back a little bit from this flirting with godlike technology. You even were talking a little bit about posthumanism, right? And
Totally. Yeah.
that's maybe an episode for another day because I would love to go down
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
path with you as well. But um, once be more like raw, it made me think of even like the idea of language, right? That
Yeah.
we've so much, our language is such a noun based language where so many of the
Yeah.
languages that are of indigenous folks are verb based languages, right? So what does it mean
Totally.
to rock, right? Or to
Yeah.
desert, right? Or what does it
Yeah.
mean for us to winter right now, right? Like we are winter, we are wintering.
Yeah.
Um to just change
Oh.
that frame set of our minds around the
Hmm.
idea of being a verb in a way that it connects us back to the more than human world.
Totally. Oh yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. Yeah. Let's be rock, man. Right. Rock on. I know. I love that. That's great.
Yeah,
That's great.
it's
I'll
good.
have to go sit on a rock and think about that.
I love that. Yeah, totally. I've been hugging a lot of trees lately. I'm literally becoming a tree hugger. Like I'm just like
Good.
finding trees where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna just put a hand on you and I'm gonna hug you. And most
Yeah.
recently, I was in DC, and I've been trying to make it a custom to go visit the watershed wherever I am. Like
Yeah.
and this idea of getting kind of back to source, and water is a source of so much of life, right? All of life, I guess.
Totally.
And so I ran down to the Potomac, and I turned the corner after I went over the bridge, and there was this tree that just was glowing yellow, and I literally went up to it and picked up one of the leaves that it had discarded on the ground and just hugged it.
Oh, yeah.
I brought it home to my son, and I was like, look at this leaf. Look how incredible this leaf is.
Oh, I love that. No, that'd be great. I'm a firm believer in the use of psychedelics to connect with your environment. So that sounds like a great, I'm not saying you did that, but when I think of hugging a tree, I'm like, oh yeah, take some mushrooms, hug a tree.
That's also another episode, JD, that we'll have to come back to. One of my New Testament professors was a part of that Johns Hopkins study a few years back. So that's
no kidding.
Yeah.
Small world. Wow, that's totally cool.
I think there's a lot of really interesting things coming out of that research that, again, talk about the church not being ready for, but really needs to embrace that conversation just to see what, I'm coming from a Wesleyan perspective, right? Where John Wesley was so obsessed with religious experience, and the experience people are having through a variety of different psychedelics that are helping not only with their mental health, but are introducing them to God, people who have been atheist or agnostic, and they're having these encounters with God that, like, I don't know. I just think it's worthy of an exploration, but.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, that resonates with Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, too, the process theology.
Totally.
That I could have brought up, too. That's another conversation, so.
I mean, you have to become a regular guest on the podcast, JD. I don't know. There's just so many things for us to talk about here, but.
Enough.
I will say, just thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us, all the listeners here, and more than anything, just for the honest, right? Like, I know my boss will often talk about, contemplation being a long, loving look at the real,
Yeah,
and I think
that's good.
I think that's what this conversation has been, is just a long, loving look at the real. And that sometimes that means we have to come face to face with things that aren't always sunshine and happiness, right?
Yeah, totally.
So, and with that, right, it's not a giving up and sticking our head in the ground either, right? There's still work to be done, and there's still conversations to be had and lessons to be learned. I mean, like, you don't go on to do a PhD if you're giving up,
Sure, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder, but that's we all do, right? Yeah.
Well, was it Martin Luther, I think, who said, even if I knew the world was ending tomorrow, I'd still plant my apple tree,
Oh yeah, so that's a ghost right there. That's a ghost. Yeah, that apple tree. Yeah.
Whether it was actually him or not, I don't know if it was attributed to him, whatever. But
yeah, I don't know. I mean, we can pretend. No, I like it, but no, it's a great sentiment, nevertheless, right? Yeah. No,
JD, thank you. Blessings to you, and we look forward to future conversations for sure.
Thanks for having me on, Phil.
Take care. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Collective Voice, the premier podcast of the 787 Collective. For more information, visit us at 787collective.org or find us on social media. And if you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate us, and share a review. For when you do, you're tricking the algorithm for the common good.